Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Katie Burke.
On the show today, I have special guest Stan Van Etten. He was the editor of Hunting and Fishing Collectibles magazine for the past 20 years. Welcome to the show, Stan. How are you today?
Well, fine. Glad to have an opportunity to talk about the magazine.
So before we get into the magazine, which was your past 20 years, before that, though, you've had multiple careers. It was your retirement career. So let's talk about those years prior to the magazine and how that led up to getting into the magazine. So yeah, kind of give us your little backstory there.
Well, it's a kind of an interesting story and a bit of a long one. But when I grew up in the Midwest in Illinois, and my dad was a college professor there at Western Illinois University. So growing up in the Midwest, and I after high school and college, I went to the University of Chicago and got a couple of graduate degrees there. My interest was, sort of in history and also in literature, primarily literature, I guess. So then after that, I transitioned to Auburn University for about 8 years in Auburn, Alabama. And then after a kind of a tenure there at Auburn University, I migrated to Florida. Auburn University in Alabama is not that many hours away from Panama City Beach, Florida, in the Panhandle area. We ended up there for a good while. I was a department head at the State Community College there in the literature and language arts area. Finally, after more than 20 years in the university classroom, I wearied a little bit of grading papers, I guess, or whatever. But over those years, I had come in contact with college publisher sales reps, and they would come by on a regular basis to tell the college faculty and all schools around the country what was new and best and greatest from their publishing house. And I had made friendships with some of the college publisher reps, sales reps, and having finally grown a little bit weary of grading freshman essays and one thing and another, the idea of being a sales rep and a field editor for McGraw-Hill publishing company, but it had a lot of appeal. And so we moved to New England, and for the next almost 8 years, I was a field editor and college textbook sales rep for McGraw-Hill out of New York. Long story short, that involved the next transition was to move from New England back to the South, where our family, our grown boys, our grown sons were. We settled in North Carolina. Interestingly, that's where the decoy interest came from. It's kind of a bit of a story in itself. My wife and I had always been weekend antiquers, and we were interested in early American stuff, but just that was kind of recreation. Every other weekend or so, we'd jump in the car and go teaking. And it happened that at this point in time in North Carolina, there was a new decoy wildfowl museum that was being created, and we got involved with that. We went down to see what it was all about. And, of course, the fact that it was antique decoys intrigued us, but I had never in my entire life thought about collecting wooden ducks. I really hadn't. Though we'd collected a lot of other things that were... anyhow, we got involved with the building and organizing of the new decoy museum there in Core Sound, North Carolina. I was intrigued by the historical decoys that they had in the museum there, and really had a lot of I had a lot of interest in that. But as the more I learned about the old decoys that had been made there in that area and used by hunters who came down the East Coast. to a lot of different hunt clubs down there on the Atlantic seaboard. The more I thought about that, there was one magazine at the time called Decoy Magazine. It's still in operation. So I ordered all the back issues of the past issues of Decoy Magazine, and that was quite a few. That was a big box, more than one box. As I studied and read through these back issues of Decoy Magazine, I really became intrigued. But having been in the book business, so to speak, with McGraw-Hill for 7 or 8 years, I thought to myself, this is a really interesting magazine, but I wonder if there's a magazine out there that covers more than just decoys. Why isn't there a magazine out there that covers all the collectibles, all the old historic artifacts that had to do with America's passion for hunting and fishing? And so I looked around and did my research, and sure enough, there wasn't any such magazine. There are a lot of sporting magazines, a lot of magazines that cover fishing and hunting articles, that sort of thing, and products. But I could not discover a single magazine that focused on the actual artifacts from the hunting and fishing tradition in America. So long story short, I launched a magazine whose central purpose was to record the history, both in print and in photos and pictures, to preserve the history of American hunting and fishing. And so the magazine, our first issue was at the beginning of
2000, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we launched it in beginning of 2000, and then concluded with our last issue, the December issue of 2020. So we did the 20-year plan that I initially had in mind.
Oh, really? I didn't realize you had a 20-year plan in mind when you started. So let's talk about those beginning years of the magazine. Did you have a goal in mind for the magazine at first, and did it evolve over time, or how did you expect it to go in the beginning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I did. I very much did have a goal in mind. I was interested in two things. I was interested, in the antiques, in the artifacts, the old 100-year-old decoys and what have you. I was interested in that, but I was also interested in more than just the artifacts. I didn't just want to buy a bunch of old decoys and put them on the shelf and say, well, yeah, those are interesting, they're pretty. I wanted to know the story, because old decoys, like old anything else, have a story, and they have a history. And this was kind of, Decoy Magazine had touched, for a number of years on that very thing, the decoy itself, and the decoy's history. Who made it? When was it made? Why is it different from somebody else's decoy? But the thing about the Decoy Magazine was that decoys was basically all they covered. It was all the magazine covered. Everything was about decoys, and I was interested in creating a magazine that had not only the artifacts and the history of the artifacts with regard to decoys, but I was interested in all the other things that went along with American history of fishing and sporting, which would get into spear fishing, for example, up in the North Country, the decoys, the fish decoys that were made for ice fishing, and the whole realm of fishing generally, from dry fly, wet fly, all kinds of fly fishing, and just, the split bamboo poles that were made for the fly fishing folks. So, and the stories behind those. It was just a matter of wanting to discover the artifacts, have somebody, write an article about them, but also record the history. Who owned it? And outdoor sports in America has a grand tradition. There have been the Northeast, the Northwoods, the Midwest, the different, bird flying patterns and migration patterns. There were all these other things that went into the story of America's hunting and fishing past that I wanted to cover and to preserve the history. Well, What happened was that when we published the first issue, I had a table of contents that was kind of a potpourri that touched on all these different things and made very clear to the readers that this was going to be a magazine that covered not only the hunting and fishing artifacts, from fishing reels to guns and all of that stuff. So, long story short, after we launched the magazine, I had put out a fairly significant bit of advertising for the upcoming launch of this magazine. In fact, one of the first key ads that I ever ran was I think a half-page ad in Ducks Unlimited. And
I need to go back and look for it.
Yeah. And it seems to me, if I recall, I just wanted to get the information out there to the sporting world people. Mm-hmm. And because of my involvement with the Decoy Museum here in North Carolina, anyway, I came up with I consulted with a bunch of folks, and they said, "Well, put an ad in on Ducks Unlimited," and so I did. It was a little pricey at the time, but we got a strong response from that ad and from several other ads that we placed. And I guess we had, I don't know, we probably had 300 or 400 subscribers, before the first issue came out.
Wow.
I remember at an auction, one of the large national decoy auctions, especially in the Northeast. We were there on the coast of Maine at that auction, and we had flyers put out on the coffee tables and stuff at the resort there. And we were sitting there, and nobody knew who we were. My wife and I were just there, kind of observing. But there were a lot of people that picked up the flyer that we had on these coffee tables, and they'd look at each other and say, that'll never go. Guess what? It did.
It did, yeah.
And so we had, after the first issue got out, there was a big show in the Milwaukee area, and we flew up there with 3 or 4 boxes of the first issue, and it disappeared like hotcakes, and the response was just overwhelmingly positive. And so I guess, by the third issue or so, we had probably had 1,500 subscribers or something like that. I think, but the thing is that the subscribers were, they knew what they were subscribing to. They knew a friend who'd got a copy, or one way or another. They knew what they were buying into. And the great thing is that for the 20 years that we published it, we didn't lose virtually anybody, and in fact it continued to grow because these were people who talked to each other. They belonged to local decoy clubs or collecting groups or what have you.
In that first issue, did you primarily write it, or when did you start gathering outside writers, and how did that all begin?
Yeah, great question. Well, there wouldn't have been much of a magazine if I'd had to write the articles, especially in that changed during the 20 years. By the time I was into my about fourth year or so, I had a lot to say. In those early first years, I was totally dependent on contributing writers, but it didn't take long. It didn't take long after the word was out that Stan's doing a magazine that's right down our alley. Here's our chance to write about what Grandpa's decoys looked like, or why he liked them so much, or the hobby, the collecting hobby for decoys, is a really stay in touch group. And so, long story short, in the 20 years, I think I made a small payment for 3 or 4 articles early on in the first couple of issues. But after that, we didn't pay $1 for any of the articles. And we had a stable of writers that for the 20 years, some of the folks wrote maybe 20 articles. Some of them wrote more than that. Sometimes, if depending on the subject or the topic or the decoy carver involved or whatever, there were some issues in the magazine where maybe there were 2 articles by the same writer, but they weren't interested in being paid. I'm sure they would have taken a check, but
they just wanted to be heard.
But they just wanted the key phrase, and through all of that, was preserve history.
I have a question. I didn't think about this earlier, but you're talking about, because you're beginning, and you're also beginning learning about decoys and the history behind them. So how did you handle fact checking in those early days? Did you just trust your sources, or like, I mean, towards the end, it would have been a different story, especially if you got to know your contributing writers. But in those first years, how did you handle that?
That's a good question, and it's like I was saying, it's a really a tight knit community, and I probably had what amounted to a board of scholars or whatever you want to call it. You know, I probably had a dozen people that just right away stepped up and stepped forward and said, "We want to help any way we can. We want to write some articles for you, but we're here if you've got a question about an article that's been submitted or something like that." Based on my having bought all the old back issues of Decoy magazine, I'd probably spent, before I actually launched the magazine, I'd probably spent the best part of a year, I guess, reading through the back issues of Decoy magazine, and you'd see author names that just kept recurring issue after issue, you know, or several times during a year. And so I, you know, although I didn't know these people personally, I did, of course, after once we got going with the magazine. But I recognized names, and these folks were just generous beyond belief with wanting to share the information and the history that they had. And there were, in fact, over the 20 years, there were a couple of occasions where somebody was sending articles in on a contemporary carver or two, and they were doing the article on this whoever it was, and they were asking the person that they were doing the article on, who in most cases was a carver, for 3 or 4 sample birds of their carving. This didn't happen early on, but it did actually happen a couple of times, and I found out it was happening because a person who'd become a good friend called me and he said, "Hey Stan, I just wanted to check something with you. I've you know, so and so is doing an article on my carving, and he wants 2 of this kind of duck and 1 of this other kind of duck, and he wants 3 or 4 of my carvings to pay for getting the article in." And he says, "Is that your policy?" And I said, "God, no, you know, no, that's not our policy."
That's sneaky.
So, you know, so that was a wake-up call, but I wouldn't want to overstress that because that only happened in a couple of cases.
Still pretty funny.
But it allowed me to contact the carver, and you know, and I didn't just say no. On a phone call, I talked to the carver at length, and I was just flabbergasted that that was happening. But you know, it was a quick steady because I had that background, you know, with looking at, I don't know how many years, but a bunch of years of back issues of Decoy magazine, and it's a you know, the collecting of decoys is a kind of a fraternity sort of thing, and you better be careful what you say about somebody, because that somebody probably is going to.
No, it's true. And, you know, I use your issues. I mean, Decoy as well, but I have a whole backlog of your issues, and I use them for this podcast and for exhibits. I mean, whenever I'm doing anything or any of our little videos, I go through, you sent me that handy little Excel sheet, which now I can do it faster. But I go through and I find every article written on the topic and do my research. And you know what's really interesting, especially with some of those really old Decoy magazines, is you can go back and you can see those very first articles on, you know, say a certain carver, and then you go, and I usually try to start at the beginning and work my way up, because you can find where opinion has changed over time, and it's interesting to watch that happen.
And you know, I don't know if you're familiar with this particular case, but there's been, during the 20 years that I did the magazine, there's been this huge controversy over what they call the Bowman bun. I'm sure you've run across articles on that. Both sides of the argument are, they're passionate about thinking that it was Bowman or it was Bunn, and I have my own opinion about that. But we ran several issues over the years that addressed the Bowman-Bunn controversy, but I think it's a pretty clear-cut decision. But there's some strong feelings out there in certain places, certain groups.
Yeah, I'm interviewing Corey in a couple weeks, Corey Rogers. So, yeah, I need to go back and look at your issues for that one.
Yeah, I'll send you those issues that had those articles in. There were about 5 issues scattered through the years.
It is an interesting topic. I'm excited. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. There was another one I can't remember. Oh, I was looking at the Evans stuff and how the opinion has changed on Evans decoys over the years as well. And that was really interesting how it's, almost gotten smaller rather than larger.
Oh, yeah. It really, and there've been issues like where, you're familiar with the idea of the lathe that can do the decoy. You have a model decoy, and you know how that works with the power lathe turning them out.
Yeah, go ahead and explain it, though. Maybe our listeners don't exactly know.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a wood shop tool called a lathe, and a lot of people, they know what a lathe is, but they probably haven't thought about it in terms of decoy carving. But if you have a model that you want to reproduce, you put it on this lathe machine that has a kind of a spindle on both ends of the decoy or whatever it is you're trying to make a copy of, and you use a cutting blade, sort of like a chisel of sorts, and you turn on the switch, and the whatever the wood you're carving goes round and round, and you direct the cutting edge by putting this little pointer thing on the artifact that you're copying. And long story short, nothing wrong with that, but it's not a hand carved decoy. And the thing too, the factor too, is that a decoy that was turned out on a lathe very often, there ends up being 100 or 500 of those decoys made, and they're all made with a copying lathe, and but then a lot of things could happen. Then they could be painted just in a routine factory sort of quick paint job deal, which makes them worth almost nothing. Or they could be painted by a professional painter, or there's any number of different kinds of stories that could but historically there were at some point in time a lot of factory made decoys and that were made from a copy lathe, and that was okay for if you're just buying this decoy to go toss in the water and shoot ducks when they fly over. There's nothing wrong with that in any case, but it complicated the world for decoy collectors, because some decoys were being sold out there as if they had been made by a particular carver or something, and anyway, you can see the implications that could come from that. But that the hobby, the collectors these days are pretty sophisticated, and of course the prices, kind of demand that people who are paying very high prices are going to know what they're buying. And if the individual doesn't know on his or her own part, there are plenty of people out there who'd be glad to tell them.
Yes, there are. So over your time, like we talked about the contributing writers, and I know you're a collector as well, which we talked about a little bit. How had the magazine, those relationships affected your personal life and as well as your personal collecting?
Oh, yeah. Well, we've gone, as I said back early on, Deb and I have been collectors of a lot of things for a long time, but the decoy, the interest in decoys, and the fact that really the interest was not only personal but professional with the magazine. We've been to a lot of places, a lot of antique shops and in where we probably wouldn't have gone before. Just a quick example: Lake Kashnagang up in Wisconsin has a great history of decoy hunting, and there was an early period, though, in the 1800s where a lot of the wealthy sports, the term, wealthy people who, just followed their passion and went duck hunting one place and pheasant hunting somewhere else, and but this area in the Minnesota, Wisconsin area just was there because of the Midwest Flyway, I suppose, in large part. But anyway, it was a great duck hunting area, and so this Lake Kashnagang, I'll send you a copy of that magazine too. When people began to collect decoys 50 years ago, 75 years ago, when they began to collect decoys for decoys' sake, and not worried about hunting them, but collecting the decoys, they discovered a lot of decoys that looked an awful lot like Upper Chesapeake Bay decoys and northeastern decoys. And the more the collectors up in the upper Midwest became aware of, how come these decoys over here in Minnesota and upper Wisconsin, Minnesota, how come they look so much like the decoys that have been discovered over in the upper Chesapeake Bay area? Well, the deal was, it turned out that the hunters and the sports who came from the Northeast, they did a lot of hunting in the upper Chesapeake area, but they also did a lot of hunting over in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Michigan, and so these same people, these same wealthy sports that had 100 decoys that were made in the Chesapeake Bay area, they took a batch of those same decoys and went to the upper Midwest when that got to be a popular place. And so these decoys, just because you found them in the Lake Kashnagang area, didn't mean that's where they were made. It just meant that the rich sports who came from New England, who had been using decoys that made from the upper Chesapeake Bay area, it just decoys travel. If the guy who owns them travels, they travel.
Yeah. So why would they have gone to hunt there from that location, like from the Northeast? Like, why would they have gone to that area?
That's probably a long story, but the fact is that once again, this kind of fraternal thing, there were certain like people used to go to the Catskills, fat cats from New York and Boston went to the Catskills, and then they went to the Adirondacks, and they built summer homes there, and it was just a matter, I think, of there were some of those same guys came down the coast, the Atlantic seaboard, and this Core Sound Museum down there in North Carolina that I was talking about earlier. The decoys moved around with these guys who just, where should we go this fall, guys? Let's go down the Atlantic coast. Let's go down to the North Carolina coast. And so the decoys traveled just because it wasn't somebody mail ordered a decoy from somewhere. These guys had dozens and probably more than maybe they had 150 decoys, and there were 5 guys in the hunting party, and they let's go to Lake Kashnagang over in upper Midwest this time. And so, but anyway, we did a series of articles on that. But there are several people who are they know the whole history of that, and they know who they even know who made the decoys and which ones were. But the underside, the flip side of that coin is that during this same period, period, there were all kinds of carvers in that upper Midwest area itself who were making decoys, but they looked entirely different. Those decoys looked entirely different from the ones that these guys brought, from the upper Chesapeake Bay area. And so, it's just what I was really going to tell you. I think your question was about collecting antiques myself.
Yes.
So here we are in central North Carolina, and 100 miles down the coast, and to the Decoy Museum. But somewhere in between there is Greensboro, North Carolina, and I walk in an antique shop there, not knowing that, not even expecting to find a decoy there. But I walk in there, and in this little dark corner of one room in the antique mall, here's this old decoy sitting up there on a shelf, just looking sad as hell. And I pull it off the shelf and look at it, and I say, I don't know where that came from, but it had a big brand on it, a big incised brand. It said Hoard, Hoard, all in large caps, carved into the bottom of the decoy, Hoard. I had no idea what that meant. I figured it meant a guy's name, but I didn't know. But anyway, so several years go by. I kept it. I showed it to a few people at some of the national regional shows, and they didn't know. And then this guy, one of the collectors from that Koshkonong Lake area, and I are talking. He's submitting a couple of articles on the history of duck hunting and decoys from the Lake Koshkonong area, and I'm talking to him, and he sends me a bunch of pictures for the article, and lo and behold, one of the major hotels on that lake was the Hoard Hotel, Hoard, and so it was a high-end kind of hotel place, and they supplied decoys for the rich sports who came out there to hunt, and so this was one of the local type decoys as opposed to the upper Chesapeake area, and it was one that the Hoard Hotel had, that was 100 years old, and so suddenly, this writer calls in to do an article or two. It turned out to be a 3-article series, but he, here it was, bam, all at once. And I said, several people at shows, when I'd taken that around different shows because I wanted to find out what it was, where it come from, and had wanted to buy it from me, but I didn't want to sell it because I wanted to know what it was first. And so my hanging on to it paid off, because now here it was, and not that many of those that are marked like that with a hand carved. The letters Hoard are probably an inch and a half tall, and they're deeply incised with a jackknife, or something.
I didn't know hotels had decoys. Makes sense. Like they at certain times of the year, they're almost like resorts for hunters in that time period. So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I have one decoy that came up in a Guyot and Dieter auction. They're one of the largest, if not the largest, decoy auction house, and I have one decoy that I got. I was able to get it out of one of their auction sales that is marked on the bottom. It has a carver's initials, but I've never been able to figure those out. But it has an incised brand on the bottom of the decoy that says NYC, and then an ampersand, the and sign says New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. How's that for a mouthful on a brand? So NYC and New York. I'm sorry, New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. Hudson River, was of course merged into the New York Central after a while. But so well, what's the big deal about that? Well, why would a railroad have wood decoys. Why would the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad want to have decoys? Well, because they did a hell of a business with these fat cat sports who traveled around to different locations. They would rent 2 or 3 cars with an express train, and next thing they know, they were not in New York, or Boston, or Baltimore. They were, they were somewhere on the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad property. And my guess, I can't prove this, but why else would a decoy be branded with a railroad, on the bottom? Well, the answer is that these guys, the railroads did a heck of a business with rich hunters, sport hunters, and so my guess is I pretty well take it to the bank. I think that there were trains that were chartered, for groups of these guys, and I think that probably the railroad company owned some sporting lakes, hunting grounds. I mean, the railroads made a pot of money from those. I've done a couple of articles on that too.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It was a common kind of thing for a group of 30 or who knows how many guys who knew each other, and they said, let's go hunt this year at Lake so-and-so. It might have been in Michigan. It might have been in Minnesota. Who knows where.
I mean, there's evidence of them going to North Carolina on the railroad for sure. So before we go, we wrap things up. Is there anything that you want to add, or a story you want to tell, or anything, something that we hadn't talked about that we didn't get to that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, well, I one of my favorite stories, or I guess it's not a story. It's just it's kind of a position that I have developed, and it is this, that auction houses today, it's not unusual. If it's a decoy auction, it's not unusual for them to have half a dozen or more decoys that sell for 6 figures, and there are a whole lot of decoys in a decoy auction from a major house that maybe have as many as 50 decoys that sell for several $1,000s, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So it's a serious. These people who collect these historic artifacts, it's a serious passion that they have. And so with the 20 years of publishing the magazine, if I had one preachment to make, it would be this: that if you love old stuff and you have a passion for it, it's not just because you want the item. It's not just because you want the artifact, because you want the artifact because it is, in fact, great folk art. You want it because it's a great thing in and of it and by itself. But there's another reason. There are 2 reasons why you want it. And the second reason may be almost more important than the first, which is you want it because it has a great story, and you want to know the story. And if there's one thing that Hunting and Fishing Collectibles magazine did in its 20 years, it linked the artifact with its story. And I ran many articles that pictured decoys and showed brands on the bottom or whatever. And guys, I can't even guess how many times they would write or call me and say, hey, I thought this decoy was from the Chesapeake area. Turns out it was made in Washington State. A guy out there called me and said, hey, I got a decoy just like yours, and I can tell you who made it. He just lives 30 miles from where I am out here in Washington State. So, decoys can be, they have a story, and sometimes the story is really, really interesting. And it, it without the story, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I knew Abe Lincoln, but nobody knew where he came from. I mean, how silly. Why would you want to know Abe Lincoln if you didn't know anything about him? So we kind of the brand of our magazine in terms of focal points was that there's the decoy, hurrah, and there's the story, double hurrah. And so that's one thing that I would kind of like underline or spotlight or something, because it's not just collecting, another decoy. It's collecting a decoy that is worthy of discovering the story behind it.
Yeah, and as a nonprofit supported by hunters, it's important to know where our history came from. And very, very well said. Thank you, Stan. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
How can people reach you if they want to get any back issues or anything like that?
Yeah, great. Well, our website, we're continuing on with our website because we have available issues from all of the issues from the 20 years, and our website is www.hfcollectibles.com. Oh, and let me give you my the direct email, not just the website, but the direct email is hfcollectibles@aol.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show today, Stan. It was fun.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks to our special guest, Stan Van Etten. Thanks to our producer, Chris. And thanks to you, our listener, for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.